At the close yesterday, we began looking at the Ajna binary, and we began by looking at the logical collective process that we find in the third tone of action. And remember that this name in and of itself can be a misnomer. That is, it's not about the need for action, it is about the plan of action. In other words, it's about formalization, it's about coming up with an organizational concept, it's about making action something that can be possible and something that can be possible in a secure way. Today we're going to begin with the fourth tone, and we're going to begin with the fourth tone of meditation. And of course, this is the department of inner vision. And its relationship is to the abstract circuitry. That is, the abstract mental circuitry that goes from the 64 to the 47 to the 11 and to the 56. Remember that when we're dealing with the Ajna binary, we're dealing with something very important. We're dealing with two metamorphic processes. Two metamorphic processes. The throat center is our center of metamorphosis, that is, this is where the thyroid system is. But the 62nd gate and the 56th gate, both of those are metamorphic gates. They are actually gates of translation in that sense. In other words, that both of them are there to translate the visual into language. And this transition of the visual into language, this is a metamorphic process. It's so interesting to recognize when I talk to you about how the acoustics is what's important in terms of the linking of all these various tones, that here when you're dealing with the Ajna binary, this is when that acoustic quality is really at its most powerful. In other words, it is the responsibility of the departments related to the Ajna to be the spokesvoices, if you will, for the whole. So that when you're dealing with the logical expression going through the 62nd gate, this is the spokesperson for the logical collective pattern and the logical collective movement. But when you're dealing with the fourth tone and you're dealing with the abstract, what you're dealing is the spokesperson as historian. It's very important to see that out of logic, out of the collective logic comes all of our projection into the future, which means, our philosophies and all of our theories, all of those things. But when you're dealing with the abstract process, you're dealing with history. Now, of course, in saying that, though history is fundamental to the development of humanity, that history, for most of its history, has been purely subjective. And that history in and of itself is no guarantee that the past is being recorded truthfully. None whatsoever. I mean, imagine if the Third Reich had won the Second World War, what the history of the Jews would look like. We already have evidence of that in the long-time struggle between Rome and Carthage, which took place before the very first millennium. And they fought 3 different wars with each other, very famous wars called Punic Wars. And they fought these wars. And when the Romans finally defeated Carthage, who had been a fierce enemy of theirs, they didn't just take victory. They salted the land. They killed everybody, at least as many as they could. And they destroyed all of their historical documents. The fact is, we know very little about Carthage, because the only thing we know about Carthage is what the Romans want to tell us. And the Romans were the winners. And there is no other reference. Now, the reason I tell you that is to understand how subjective history can be. How subjective the abstract process can be. Remember that everything about the abstract process is the ability to be able to transfer the visual into the oral. Now think about 2 people who go to the same place on a vacation, and 2 people who see things differently. One of them is only interested in the restaurant than the swimming pool. The other one wants to go hiking all around. when they come back and they tell the history of their experience of that place, you're not going to be able to see the relationship between the two of them. Depending on what you see is the subjectivity of your history. And of course, this leads to enormous problems at the mundane level for abstract people. See, whenever I'm dealing with people that have the 64 or the 47, I know the pain of that. I know the pressure of that. Here we have this pressure that you have to make sense out of things. But the whole thing to recognize about that is that you never have the whole picture. You never have the whole picture to reference. And when I say you never have, you don't get access to the whole picture. Everything about the way the abstract pressure works is that the abstract pressure works like the teasers before the main feature that you're going to watch in the theater. Now, you can watch a trailer and sort of have an idea of what the story is. But there's an awful lot missing in that history. There's an awful lot of detail that's simply not there. And so you're only going to have a subjective feeling about what is really in that movie. You don't really know until you go and see the whole film. Now, the way that the 64th gate works as a pressure gate is that that's what it does. It gives you trailers. You only get trailers. You never get a full-length picture. So the 64 that is thinking back to an experience with its partner that was an ugly experience, had nasty consequences, when it tries to make sense out of that experience, it didn't see it all. It's not getting it all in terms of what it's working with. All it has to work with is the trailer. Now, the trailer might be just the argument. Just the confrontation. So be very, very careful about taking the subjectivity of history as truth. You see, because the collective as a whole is so similar in its goals and in the way in which it reaches others through sharing, whatever, people are always confusing ideas with opinions. Always. And vice versa. Somebody has an idea and somebody else thinks that's their opinion. These are very different things. After all, if you're working on the logical process, you're not dealing subjectively. You may not be correct in your objectivity, but nothing in logic is ever going to work if it's subjective. As far as I'm concerned, 1 and 1 is 3. You can be as subjective as you want in logic, but you're not going to win in that battle. But the fact is that the abstract is always going to be subjective, and people are always taking that as gospel. Remember, this is where our whole belief systems come out of. And the belief system is always out of a subjective history. Think about that. Think about Jesus Christ. This is subjective history. There has never been, ever been concrete evidence that he even existed. None. No matter how much the Catholic Church would like to find such a thing. There is no evidence. We have subjective history. There was this really nice guy who may have been male, female, gay, black, white, long hair, short hair, who may have been this or that or whatever, who may have walked on water, who may have had miracles, who may have done all of that. It's subjective history. And that subjective history, once it's codified and written down, so you've got the book of Matthew and John and Luke, it's all there. People take that as the word, don't they? And they take that subjective history as if that subjective history is an objective fact. It is not. It's like creationists who take the fact that the Bible states that in 5,426 BC the world was created. By the way, dinosaur bones were put here to fool us. Well, that's what they say. The only reason they're there is to test our faith. That only God can play such a game on us. Eh? Now, of course, that's history. That's history, but it's subjective history. And the moment we take subjective history as truth, in other words, we make it logical, we're in big trouble. Throughout the Piscean Age, the last several thousand years, that's all we've done. As a matter of fact, what we do with logic is that we confine logic to what we call science in order to separate it from God, faith, spirituality, you name it, whatever. Because you see, the history that holds us in line morally, and remember, the collective is only concerned with morality. You know, that morality that holds us in line is a morality based on subjective history. Go to any tribe anywhere in the world and ask them the history of their people, and at some point they're going to get back to creation and some kind of form of Godhead. You know, it's going to be the egg, or it's going to be two sky gods screwing, or it's going to be this or that, or whatever the case may be. But they're all going to go back to some kind of subjective history, and everybody is expected to believe that. I mean, if you believe that, you're morally acceptable. So we're under enormous pressure in the Piscean age to take subjective history and to make it our truth. And it's interesting to watch what has happened in the historical profession. You know, because of the baby boom and because of the advantages and affluence of the West, we had millions and millions and millions of young people who became professional historians. God knows what for, but we got a lot of people teaching high school history, I guess, so whatever. But we got all these historians. And one of the things that's interesting about the profession of history is that it is changed. And the way it's changed is that official history must be based on 3 subjective views. In other words, they recognize that when it comes to history, you can never be objective. Never. Not possible. I mean, think about somebody who would work in the Reagan administration. And think about 8 or 9 different people who had contact with him over the 8 years, who each write a book about the history of that time. Now, certain things are going to coincide. We know that. But many other things are going to be different. People project. People don't necessarily hear. People are left out of the loop. Everybody's got a different slant. All of those things. So what the professional historian credo now is all about is that you have to have 3 different references, 3 different subjective views, and out of that try to find the common ground that stands up, and the rest of it is just maybe. Now, we never had that. In other words, we're trying very hard to develop an objective view of history. And of course, this is one of the most important steps that we take, is trying to be objective about where we're coming from so that we can remain objective where we're going through. In other words, we have this pure movement going through. I talked about the Prana of the way this department of vision works. That is, that when you're looking at the third tone is looking outwards into the world. Looking outwards into the world to see the world, but also looking outwards into the world to see what the world can look like. In other words, to project the pattern into the future. But when you're dealing with the fourth tone, you're dealing with an inward process, inward vision. These are people that are always trying to look inward to find the inner landscape. Now, the whole thing about the logic process is that the logic process is that you go from chaos to order. And the abstract process is you leave order behind and enter into chaos. Meditation. It's not about any kind of formal understanding of this word. It's all about not jumping. One of the most important things about understanding the relationship between chemistry and the mind, what I discussed with you yesterday, how the mind latches on to chemistry, that the way in which the abstract circuit operates in the mind is that it is deeply linked to the emotional system. It's deeply linked to the emotional system, and it's deeply linked to the emotional system through the stream of feeling from the 35 to the 36 to the 30 down to the 41. Now remember something about the stream of feeling. It has no potential of awareness. None. Never will. And yet also to keep in mind that this very stream is the stream of the human experiential way. In other words, history is directly the result of this stream. You know, my joke about the gates in the head center, where the abstract and the logic is always his story, and the individual is my story. You know, mystery. You know, the difference between history, his story, and mystery, my story. The collective is only interested in history. They're interested in their story. And nothing collects stories better than the 56th gate. This is the great gate of storytelling. After all, the only way that you can get somebody to see your subjectivity is to tell them the story. And if you can tell them the story from your perspective, they may in fact see it just like you see it. And of course, that's the whole goal of the 56. The whole goal of the 56 is to get you to have exactly the same inner vision. In other words, they can't take you to that place where they vacationed. They're not going to show you logically graphs, architectural designs, overhead photographs. You know, they're not going to do all of that. What they're going to do is that they're going to tell you a story from their perspective so that you get to see that place the way they want you to see it. I mean, you know, that's what it's like with an abstract friend who's just been to a movie that excites them. You know, the hardest thing for them not to do is tell you the whole damn story, just to get you to see why they're excited about that movie. You know, they have to let you see it. They have to tell you the story. And of course, we're enchanted by storytelling. You know, if you look at, I don't know when that was. I guess a course I may have done 3 or 4 years ago, in which I talked about the deep mutation that took place about 85,000 years ago, the dropping of the larynx. And all of this took place in a mutation that took place in the 12th gate and the 11th gate, which are polarities to each other. The 12th gate, which is the gate of articulation, out of that 12th gate comes our capacity to be able to manipulate the frequency and thus create identifiable and repeatable sound formulas. But at the same moment that that mutation took place in the throat, the mutation took place in the 11th gate. You see, as far as I know, and as far as what I was told by the voice, the kind of consciousness that we experience, roughly, that we experience today, is about 85 to 90,000 years old, no more. And that before that mutation, before the 1211 mutation, that what you have basically is that you have a mammalian system with a dormant mental capacity. You got a mammalian system with a dormant mental capacity, and basically what's dormant there is the frontal lobes. In other words, that they are not developed sufficiently to be able to distinguish the difference. The greatest possibility in that was probably Neanderthal, because if you look at Neanderthal, you can see that the development of the cranium made it possible ultimately to have space for the frontal lobe, even though they did not have functioning frontal lobes. I mean, as far as we can tell. So one of the things about the nature of the 11th gate and the 12th gate, but in this context, the 11th gate, is that it's enormously important for us because this is where our intellectual capacity began. And the first law of the intellectual capacity, the moment that humanity had this gift of being able to have a reflective consciousness that they could have access to, that in the moment that that took place, the very first rule of the species came in there. That rule of the species is always, again, security, but here the security is something else. The security is remembering and storing the past in order to make the present secure. That's very important. And it's one of the things to understand about human development. You know, if you watch, I've watched many litters come into the world from pets of mine. And you know, those mammals will have to go through the same learning process each generation. I mean, the same stuff has to be relearned every generation. It just does. The whole thing about humanity is that we have this enormous capacity to take advantage of the past. And to take advantage of the past so that we don't have to go through all of those processes again, learn them all over again. We can take the word of the past We don't have to reinvestigate everything in order to grasp it and waste our energy. We can take the word of the past. In other words, history has been essential for us. The storing of history has been essential to us. Now, what I'm really telling you here is that the fourth tone is a receptor. In other words, to carry the fourth tone is about being a receptor and a holder of the past. Now, that often makes it very difficult for the fourth tones to live in the present, and practically impossible for them to move into the future. In other words, that their main responsibility in this life is to keep on, and you'll pardon my expression, regurgitating the past. Bringing the past back out as a reference point for everything that's going on in their existence in the moment. And of course, what they're teaching us in that is that we can never ignore the past. You know, we have all kinds of cliches about that. Ignore the past at your own risk. You know, all of these things. You know, we've been taught over and over again by historians that history repeats itself. You know, that we have to be aware that the past is something that we have to keep in touch with. So one of the difficult things for the fourth tone is that they don't have this same kind of involvement in the collective process. In other words, they don't have this involvement in which they're seeking out a secure future. And it can appear that they never really get into that flow. And of course they can't. They're not part of being in the flow. You know, they're the source of where the flow came from. It came out of their experience, and they keep on reminding us of that. You know, a fourth tone person, when they meet somebody and that person tells them something that's going on that may lead into the future, they're going to tell them something about the past that has a relationship to that. That's always their gift. In other words, they bring the balance to what happens to us when we accept the objective. You know, the moment we accept the objective, even though in logic you're always going to have, you know, opposed forces, that it's very, very important for us to see that we cannot just rely on that alone, because we're nothing without our past. We're nothing without our history. You know, in this way you can see what I mean about holding on to one's cultural roots. In other words, it's an essential thing to hold on to the past. It gives us continuity, and it allows us to have a natural flow into the future. It brings chaos. I mean, this is a very chaotic department. You know, if you could actually go and visit this department, instead of everybody sitting there at their terminals and, you know, being very busy, you know, here's the fourth tones running around like mad, you know, all kinds of things going on, because they're always abuzz with the past. Now look, if you take that to the mundane level, and you're not following your strategy, and you're not honoring your authority, if you're carrying a fourth tone, you know, the restlessness of the Ajna binary is incredibly powerful. There's this unbelievable restlessness that's going on because, of course, most people that have the 64 or the 47 or anything in that stream, what they really think their role is in life is to come up with a logical, factual answer. I mean, that's what screws them up. You know, they have this subjective history and they want to concretize it so that they can get rid of it. And they can't. Mind has no inner authority. The only thing of value of subjective history is when you share it. When you don't talk about what you're going to do tomorrow with somebody, but you talk about what you did the other day. It's typical fourth tone, to always bring the reference of the past into the present. Now, of course, if they're convinced that they have to resolve that, if they're convinced that they have to not only tell the story, but know what the moral of the story is, then they're really in trouble. If they just tell the story and let everybody else figure out what the moral is, everything is fine. It's like Aesop's fables, you know? There never should have been an answer at the end. You know, it just should have been left open. That's perfect. Let everybody else try to figure out what the hell that really means. I mean, Jesus didn't explain his parables. That's typical 56 stuff. He didn't explain anything. He just told these stories. And everybody's going, I know what that means. I mean, turn on the television and go to the freak religious channels. They're some of my favorites, eh? I mean, they are so much fun to watch. And they have some of the ugliest women I have ever seen on earth who have more hair than God, eh? I mean, there's one of them there that is so incredible. Every time I look at her, I laugh. I just sit there and giggle. And she cries, and she does the whole number, and she does her interpretation of, a gospel, a phrase. That's magic. See, that's when you get them all going. But the moment that the idea person wants to concretize for you what they're trying to tell you, that's the moment it loses all its value. It's not logical after all. It's not objective after all. That wonderful, wonderful story of a father telling a story to his wife and his son. And the story is dragging on, and the little boy finally looks at his father and says, "Is this true?" And his mother smacks him on the back of the head, and she says to him, "It's just a story." That's what stories are about. They're not about saying this is truth. It is about saying this is subjective. This is what I experience. You see, only when you understand that we are here to share our experiences, that's all Mind Throat is about, then you can see that if all these abstract forces are sharing their experiences instead of making them the law, then we're all going to be enriched and much wiser about the way in which things operate. You have 10 people and they're going to walk across a bed of fire. You got to hear all their stories. And when you hear all their stories, you're going to have a sense of what that experience really is. And it's not a truth that you get out of that. It's a sense that you get out of that. That's why this is the sensing circuit. You get a sense of it. It's not truth. It's not the understanding stream. It's not about getting it. It's a sense. This is ephemeral. This is just, bless you, this is just something that's floating around. And of course, the moment that we see that, that's the moment that we don't get hooked. Because you see, the moment that you take an idea as objective, that's the moment that you're guaranteed to bring pain to this planet. Karl Marx was an 11. I mean, give us all a break. That's a wonderful idea. It's an old idea. We're all equal. We should all share fairly. Ba, 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 ba. But it's just an idea. It is a subjective idea and based on his subjective appraisal of history. Because if you happen to read Das Kapital, and I would not advise that to anybody other than somebody who's locked up in an asylum and can't sleep, because it will at some point put you to sleep if it doesn't kill you. It's one of the most boring tracts ever written. But the fact is that boring subjective tract was written as logic and taken as fact and turned into hell for millions and millions and millions and millions of human beings. Ideas, dangerous business. Look at Einstein's idea. We turned it into the most savage, vicious piece of technology anybody can imagine. The idea can be a delight. But the moment you concretize those ideas, the moment you want to turn them into fact, then you have to be very, very careful with what you're dealing with. So it's important for us to see that the 11th gate has an enormous impact on society, and this is the great gate of teaching. Look at the 11-4, one of those rare 3 accented gates, where you've got the guru and the sage and the teacher. You have all these exalted expressions of teaching. And there's an assumption that teaching is the law, the truth, whatever. Well, it's not, after all. You see, subjective teaching was an authority for us when we needed to learn to survive. So experience was important. Don't eat that mushroom, you'll die. The only way that we can hunt this animal is this way. You know, there were all these things that they learned from experience. And of course, that was essential for them. But the fact is that when you're trying to manipulate the planet with ideas, you know, that's when you're running into all kinds of difficulties. We're not coming out of the same kinds of experiences. We do not have the same view of the world. And that the only way we're going to have a foundation where we all meet is through logic, because logic is fact. Logic is verifiable. What we have now is that the idea is dying, and we don't know it. You know, I got this new age, it's not mine, new age tech music, and that often is mysteriously in the cassette player in my car. And every once in a while I turn on the engine and this is going boom, 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 boom. And then there's a pause and there's Osho. And there he is saying, all ideas are crap. You know? Now, of course, he was logical, so it was natural for him to say that. I mean, you know, speaking out of himself. However, there's a, you know, it's a dying thing. Remember that the abstract process, particularly the abstract feeling stream, because it's never going to be aware, because it's going to be eliminated in terms of our next evolutionary step, that you also have to see that ideas will have their day. In other words, we have to get to a point now where ideas are about history and not about the future. That's all. That's where they're valuable. And that's where they reach their perfection. They reach their perfection when they're making sense out of the past by allowing somebody to experience through their inner vision what that past was like, so that that other person can take in that inner vision and see it in their so-called mind's eye. See, that's the magic of a story. Now, we don't know that anymore, because what we do now with our stories is that we create the images for you. Movies, television. I can remember as a kid, before my dad bought a TV, I think it was in 53, he bought his first TV. And I can remember hearing the radio and, you know, the Green Lantern and all of these shows, Amos and Andy and all of this stuff that was on radio, Fibber McGee and Molly. And when you listen to a radio story, it was totally different. This was classic abstract. There you were, taking in the words and reversing the process, turning it into inner vision so you could really see what's going on. I mean, that was magical. Of course, that's an ancient tradition. I mean, I'm going to do that again. I'm going to do it next Saturday night. You know, I'm going to go back to the oldest tradition that we have. That tradition is to be able to create a vision and be able to bring it into somebody else as if they've experienced it themselves. That they see the experience in that sense. Now, of course, we've dulled that, but it's also a sign that evolutionarily speaking, we can no longer trust the inner vision process in humanity, because they're always trying to turn their inner vision into truth. I see it, therefore that's true. You know, somebody tells you a story, you believe them, and you turn it into truth, only to discover that it was their story. You know, I always love that expression, his side, her side, and the truth. You know? I mean, that's the whole thing about history. So what we have is that the program is already killing that process. In other words, the program is taking it away. I mean, when I was growing up and reading science fiction, you know, science fiction is the classic abstract pretending to be logical. Right? You know, they try to fill you up with a vision of the future. And of course, you can see it. But today, I mean, any third-rate SF movie today looks so damn real that there's no way you can go in there and make that up yourself anymore. You know, we have people that are doing all of that for us. I watch the History channel. Love history. They're doing the same thing. You know, and now we really have an advantage because we not only can make sense out of it, we're allowed to see the actual history. I mean, we're allowed to see it. So you turn on the History channel and there's all these, you know, these movies and stills of this war and this battle and that battle and, you know, this thing and that thing. In other words, that facility within us is being replaced by a collective technology. Now, it doesn't make it logical. It's still abstract. I mean, after all, the position of the camera is already subjective. And what the camera is going to see is going to be subjective. You know, it is the way that the abstract operates. However, it's not being left to us anymore that we're the ones that have to be responsible for making that inner vision work. You know, we have to be shown now over and over and over again, don't misunderstand this story. Because if you misunderstand this story, Waco, Texas, classic example. Eh? I mean, you know, the revisionism that's going on in the way in which this story is viewed. Same pictures. I mean, over and over and over again, the same pictures. You know, it's like the Zapruder film of the Kennedy assassination. I mean, my God, how many times people have analyzed that piece of film and come up with a different sense of what's there. That's the abstract process. That's why you can never trust it. In the end, all we can do with the abstract is give it the benefit of the doubt and logically vote on it. And that's what we do. So, you know, people are sitting around and they're brainstorming and everybody is coming up with an idea. You know, when there is a consensus that that idea may be the best idea, make the most sense, then they can logically come to an agreement about trying to incorporate that idea as the fact. It's still abstract. So the whole business about inner vision is all about that when you come into the world with the fourth tone, you have a responsibility to take people into your world to see what you have seen. That makes you very vulnerable. In other words, fourth tones by their very nature end up being the kind of people that talk about their own private life even though they wonder why they're doing it. They're the ones that are letting you in on the subjective history. And they have to let you in on it through their eyes. Now, of course, it also means they have the power to do that, which means they have the power to mislead you in that sense, not intentionally, but simply mislead you by what they have been able to see. Now, think about somebody who is not designed at the superficial level to be social, as an example. My father, I don't know anything about his design because I don't even know what year he was born. However, I'm sure my father was a fourth tone personality. I mean, you know, this is the kind of man that he would sit in a park and a stranger would sit down beside him and he'd tell that stranger everything about his personal life. He wouldn't tell anybody he knew. He wouldn't tell his friends or his family. You know, he'd pick out some stranger and tell the story to some stranger. I mean, my mother used to go nuts. You know, she could never quite figure that one out. I mean, she's a pure individual. She thought, this is a very strange dude, eh? But that's typical fourth tone. You know, and you don't know why. Remember, this is not something that you have access to. This is what's expected of you in the totality. You're expected to be, you know, a regurgitating force, constantly reminding people of your past in order for them to tune into what makes sense. I mean, one of the beautiful things about that is that when you're dealing with the fourth tone and they're telling you something out of their past and really they do not know why they're telling you that, it's always going to be of value to you. Now, it doesn't mean the value is in the intent of the story. Bless you. It's not in the intent of the story. It's there because it's there. And the person that gets it is going to get what they want because it's a parable. Because every story is a parable. And of course, they're going to interpret it accordingly. You know, when I was really first grasping helplessness, one of my favorite things was to eavesdrop. I'd sit in a cafe and I would just listen to conversations, and I could tell right away what was going on. And you can always tell those fourth tone beings. I mean, you can. No other tone is going to do that. No other tone is always going to make that reference from the past. And of course, we need them. See, when somebody can take you into the inner vision, what they're doing is bonding you. You're making a bond. I mean, after all, we can't do that. We can't be inside of each other's bodies. We don't really know who the other person is. So when you can get somebody else to see the way you see, there's this sense of, union that takes place. We see the same world. My friend Frank was always saying to me, "Your world's different than mine, Raw." He was a painter. And of course, light was everything to him. And he knew that if you just changed the way the light touches the canvas, or the illusion of light in the canvas, you change everything. You change the picture, you change the accentuation. We all see out of different eyes. So in that moment that you can take somebody into your inner vision, you take them into your being. You become one with them. It's a very beautiful thing. That's why stories are so magical. That's why the shaman was always so valued. They weren't valued for their medicine. Boy, they were lousy doctors. They were valued for their gift of being able to turn on the tribe. They would tell that story that they had been told by their fathers and their grandfathers and their great-grandfathers and their great-great-grandfathers. And there's this incredible continuity of history and life and blood and the genes all in one voice, telling the story. And of course, that telling of the story made everything possible for the tribe to survive. They had a root. And if there was nobody to take the place of the shaman to carry on the tradition of the story, that's the death of the tribe. If we lose our history, we lose everything. I mean, we lose everything. We cannot afford to lose our history. This is one of those things that's so important for humans at the genetic level, is to hold on to the continuity. The inner vision can distort the view on the outside. In other words, by seeing things so clearly inside, there's often difficulty to see what's really going on outside. After all, it's not their gift. And what often happens to fourth tone people who are not aware and ignorant is that they get lost only in the past, feeling very, very uncomfortable in the present, because they don't have the same capacity to be able to see outside. The other thing is that because this is idea-based, that those human beings that give authority to their mind, to guide their life, that they end up being guided by that subjective inner vision. Oh boy, does that ever lead to trouble? The thing that's so important about the abstract is that it's different from the logic. It's different from the logic in that the whole thing about the abstract is that it has to be involved in the past in order to be okay in the present. It's not about the future. The whole mystery of the abstract can be seen in the 4629, in its tantra. Because in that tantra comes its truth. The truth is that there is no success, there is no impact, there is no being recognized, there is no real advantage to any experience unless you're in the experience existentially. This is the whole thing about an abstract being. The abstract being, once it enters into something, must be fully in it. That's why their minds get carried away with ideas. They're fully in it. That's why they can be so neurotic, because they can be fully in the past. But the whole thing to recognize about that is that they're here to be existential. While they're processing the past, they're here to be very, very present in the now and not concerned about the future. After all, there's no future for them until they see it as the past. I mean, think about that. There's this wonderful, I think he's Schweiz, I think he's from Switzerland. I don't remember his name. Weird philosopher. He said the future is the past racing towards us. You know, this is so much the abstract being. You know, this is really their whole thing. And of course, as long as they're in the present, everything is okay. Now, of course, you can't be in the present unless you're surrendered. And you can't. And you can't be surrendered unless you're living out your strategy. You know, you're following the nature of your type. Then an abstract person is okay, because you see, in the moment that they're existential, there's no need to turn that story or that inner vision into an outer vision for tomorrow. And the moment they're not caught up in that movie of turning that inner vision into an outer vision tomorrow, I mean, after all, we all have our own strategies and authority, and none of them have anything to do with our minds. So what we're actually going to do at any given moment isn't going to be based on what we think intellectually, that is, if we're clear, obviously. So here, meditation. And that meditation is that when you notice fourth tone people, though they're here in the present, there's a part of them that's not here. There's a part of them that's always wandering around in all of those fields of the past. And they stay there. And that's their meditation. I mean, that's one of the things to realize about them. They are at their greatest peace by being absorbed with the past. I mean, nothing brings them better peace than that. Because you see, that's the way they grasp things. They don't grasp them by thinking, I'll know tomorrow. No fourth tone can ever know that it will know tomorrow. I mean, it's not going to happen. What they can rely on is that they have a sense of what they've been through. By the way, that gives them enormous strength. You know, the clearer they are about their sense of what they've been through, the more powerful they are in the moment. Less concerned about what the moment is going to bring them. So in dealing with the third and fourth tones, and in dealing with this whole process of vision, how important it is to see that it's only the logic side that is meant to push you towards the future, but push you towards the future on something that is concrete and reliable. Yet going towards the future, we cannot give up the past. We cannot give up the continuity. If we move away from the past, we will get lost. We cannot do that. So we have the abstract on the other side, and it's the responsibility of the abstract to keep on reminding all of us who are being pulled radically into the future what the past really looked like in order to have that balance. And at the moment that we have that balance, that's when we have our proper continuity, and that's when we get to be successful in the flow. That is the two tantras. In other words, the abstract process, we become successful in the flow because we're prodigal leaders. We have learned from the past in order to lead into the future. I mean, everything about streams and circuits is that you can't afford to just see them in a vacuum, and that ultimately you have to see how they all integrate together. The collective process is one process, even though we subdivide it into these two attributes of logical and abstract. But their thing is the same. Their goal is the same. Their goal is to provide stability, and that stability is through continuity, that we're always moving from a continuum of the past into a reliable future. Let's have a break. And in dealing now with this tone, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to take you through the gates, as we have done with the other tones. And we're going to begin with the 64th gate. The 64th gate is the gate of confusion. Remember that this gate places us under enormous pressure. And it's always placing us under pressure to be able to make sense of the past. But remember, you're not getting a full motion picture. You're getting trailers. You're getting chunks of material to be able to process. Genetically, it's saying that this is the most active part of the brain. Now, something to recognize about that is that when you're dealing with somebody, for example, that would have the 64, or somebody with the 61, or somebody with the 63, the qualities obviously are different. In terms of the level of activity of the 64 is the most intense activity. In other words, it's a very powerful pressure. There is no way with the 64 that being able to make sense out of anything is possible. Now that can be quite difficult for somebody who has the 64. They don't have the 47. They don't have the way of processing that through. Now, of course, when I meet them in design and I meet them in terms of analysis, the very first thing I'm telling them is, I will point to that 64th gate and say, there's your enemy. It's your enemy because there's always this stuff coming, but there's no way of being able to make sense out of it. In other words, it can simply be painful revisiting of experience. And one of the things that happens in the way in which we operate in the duality, why we like bad news, why people who sit for a reading like to be told what's wrong with them rather than right, is that we always have this tendency to look for the negative in ourselves. And one of the things that it stays consistent with us until we're awake is that what we see or what we take in, what we really store, are those things that upset us, disturb us, make us uncomfortable, make us unhappy, and that they're disproportionate to those things that make us feel good, and so forth and so on. So when you're dealing with somebody who just has the 64th gate, genetically they're there to have all of that past flying by, but they're not given the equipment in that sense to be able to resolve any of it. When you're dealing with somebody who has that in their design, you have to let them know that all they can do is relive that inner vision for somebody else and hope that somebody else can make sense out of it for them. Because if they can get somebody else to see it, maybe somebody else can, in that sense, bring it to fruition. And so what it's really saying is, find the opportunity to be able to share that, but recognize that you're not going to be able to resolve that. And that particularly when you see something as a pressure, there is no way that you can interpret that then as being a truth, a fact. It's not an idea, it's not a concept, it's not anything. It's simply a pressure that's there from the past. And subjective, obviously, because of course it's only that part of the past that you're dwelling on that's related specifically to you. It changes when you get to the 47th gate, but 47th gate's the gate of oppression. I know that there's all kinds of people who would like to change the name of these gates to make people more comfortable. Sorry. It is that. And it's important to recognize that. This is the gate of oppression. It's been the gate of oppression for 5,000 years. And of course, it's oppressive because it's very, very difficult to make sense out of things. It just is. It's difficult. And the secret to the 47th gate is the secret to the fourth tone. It's in the first line. And the first line is the line of ambition. It's actually taking stock, I think it's called. And this line of taking stock, what it's really about is being busy. That's all. It's about storing, taking stock of all those things that have gone through in your process, and it's about being busy in the now with it. It's not about the future. The future is an answer. Remember that. Anytime the abstract person is looking towards the future, what they're really looking towards is an answer to something in order that they can go beyond having it make sense so that it can be reliable, so that they can leave it behind. That's why the future is so dangerous in the abstract process. And the thing to see about the 47th gate is that the 47th gate, when you look at, remember, it's so important when you want to understand a hexagram, look at the first line for its foundation, what it basically is. Look at the fifth line for what we want it to become. And the fifth line of the 47 is the saint. And it's the saint that, despite oppression, can help the oppressed. And that's the magic of the past. You may not be able to resolve your own past and make sense out of it, yet the very story that you can tell, the very inner vision that you can take others into, can help them with their oppression. In other words, can help them make sense out of other things. It's always about sharing. It's collective after all. And it's about seeing that the sense process is never something that's going to stand on its own feet. And that subjectivity is not going to even be a single subjectivity, but it's going to be the subjectivity as it operates through others. That's not true of logic. You know, when you're dealing with a logical process, even though it's collective and you have to share it and you have to do it with others, because you're working with a pattern foundation, that there's no assumption. You either agree on the pattern or there's no further place to go. In other words, there's a commonality in the progression. There's no commonality in the progression when you're dealing with the abstract side. In other words, that you're always going to be in situations where when you meet the 47 and you're a 64, how they make sense out of it isn't necessarily the way for you to make sense out of it. But it is a way of making sense out of it. In other words, you don't have the logic that can say this is the right way of making sense out of it or not. And of course, this is one of the major dilemmas of people that have the 64. You know, they go running around in their life automatically because they are going to meet the harmonics of any gate in their life. They're going to meet a lot of 47s in their life. And what they're going to discover is that different people will make sense out of their confusion in different ways. And that there isn't necessarily a truth in them. That's modern psychology. You see, the future of psychology and psychiatry is that it has to become logical. And it's not now. It is abstract. It's abstract. You know, when human design finally penetrates the psychological and psychiatric community, for the first time, they're going to be able to be logical. What happens is that you're a 64 going to your 47 therapist. That 47 therapist, yes, they will help you make sense out of your confusion. However, that may not be the way that it really is supposed to make sense for you. You know, again, you can meet somebody who has resonance to your line or harmony to your line, or there may be dissonance to the line. There's going to be planetary differences. If you look at what's possible on the other side of the 64, you'll see that there are hundreds and hundreds of variations that are possible. Hundreds of them. And that those variations aren't just line variations, they're tone, color variations. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that sense can be made. And there's no way of establishing that that making of sense is truth. Now, if that doesn't make you nervous about ideas, I have failed in my teaching this morning. It's about seeing that ideas are fascinating. Because they're fascinating in that they come out of the subjective, and their fascination is that perhaps they have a universal or logical application. Perhaps. I mean, after all, that's what it's about. You see, we teach people the past in order that they're better prepared for the future. If you don't have a child today who's taught all the gains that we've made technologically, as an example, they're not going to be the mainstream of technological advancement in the future. By giving them access to all of that, you know, my 8-year-old uses the computer as well as I do. You know, this is the way in which history works. You know, I can show him abstractly, subjectively, because everybody uses a computer differently. I can show him subjectively from my history how that works and how he can operate it, so that he can make sense out of the technology. In order for him to be equipped to deal with that in the future, he didn't have to go through what I went through, was waiting, 40 years or 45 years before that technology was actually available and useful. So it's very important to see that when we're dealing with the subjective side, that it's not about saying, okay, ideas are useless. It's not about that. It is about saying ideas are not fact. They're not truth. They're always going to be subjective. And that it's only when we can come to consensus, logically, that we can then involve ourselves with taking an idea from the past and bringing it into the future. Remember that the collective is so deeply connected. It's not about saying that everything that comes out of the past is just about continuity and holding our line. It is about seeing that, yes, there may be things out of the past that we can bring into the future in a different way, once we can all agree that it's valid. But it can't be built on the faith in the subjective view. It has to come from a logical appraisal of whether that subjectivity can actually be something that can be generalized. The subjective on its own cannot do that. That leads us to the 1156. And the 1156 is the channel of the seeker, the searcher, curiosity. You know this horrible cliche that's burnt into wood all over America, the Desiderata, this thing that was found in this church. It has this curiosity down pat. You know, oh, it's not that. Excuse me, it's not that. Let me get my reference right. My reference is, because it was kitschy, I remembered that, so I got lost in a piece of kitsch. It was from Jonathan Livingston Seagull. Okay? And I only saw that because I was in a shop the other day and they had all these horrible plaques that they sell people. And there was this quote from Jonathan, that was a bird, wasn't it? Anyway, this bird says, you can only seek so long. Eventually you got to find something. When I was first meeting sannyasins, because I was surrounded by them in the late 80s in Ibiza, so many of them had the 1156. And I noticed something about the 1156s, that they weren't just interested in one guru. They were interested in all the gurus. They were ready to visit anybody. You know, this endless seeking trail, constantly seeking, but never finding. Remember, this is the whole secret of the channel of curiosity, is that there's nothing in the channel of curiosity about finding anything for certain. Nothing. After all, it's subjective. There cannot be any certainty. It's about seeking. And of course, this goes back to what the genetics want, not what people want. You see, if you're born to be a seeker, you want to find desperately, only to be fooled by your genes, who say, look at this idiot. They're still out there searching, searching, searching. And of course, that's us down here in the genetic department, you know, because we want them to keep on having visual experience that they store as history. I mean, if you want to find out about the gurus of India, you know, go meet these abstract people, because they'll tell you. They've had the experience. They've been with this one and that one and this one and that one, and they've heard this story and that thing, and they'll tell you all of that. And then ask them which one is for them. Different story. They can give you all the subjective appraisals, but there's no certainty there. Can't be. And of course, that can be very, very upsetting if you're carrying that energy in your design. Now, the whole thing about the 11th gate is expressed in its 5th line. I think that's the philanthropist. And it says so much about what we want from the totality when it comes to ideas. Give them away. Don't use them yourself. Give them away. Now, if you give them away and somebody else can take your inner vision and can see the same thing and recognize the same concept, then you have succeeded as a teacher. The 11th gate is here to bring teachers into the world, not to bring idea people who are trying to set up the ABC Zeppelin business, you know, to transport corn in the Midwest, which is, by the way, a favorite of mine. It's about teaching others, and it's about teaching from your experience. Now, of course, you can't start off that way. Remember when we were talking about the 17th gate, we were talking about how learning becomes teaching. Now, you have to go through the process. Now, of course, the learning that becomes teaching, the logical way, is the kind of learning that we have in the collective school. In other words, we learn things, we learn to master things logically, and then ultimately we can be logical teachers of those things. But when we're dealing with the 11th gate, we're dealing with teaching life experience. It's a different kind of teaching, and it's not a teaching based on fact. It is a teaching that is based on the sense of things and consensus on the sense of things. In other words, modern psychology, psychiatry, so many things, sociology, so many sciences that we have today, people sciences we have today, are abstract. And their value to us is not about teaching us what our behavior should be in the moment, but what our behavior has been in the past. By teaching us what our behavior has been in the past, we can see out of that, through consensus, what fits properly for the now and what possibly can carry us as behavior into the future. But it has to be substantiated logically. This is the whole thing. Ideas are great, but ideas stand alone and are subjective and can never be trusted. An idea ultimately has to be given its test, and the only way that an idea has a right to enter into society is that if it is accepted as consensus. That doesn't mean, by the way, that it gets propagandized, this fact, in order to get the consensus. That's so often the case. There are people who have ideas, for example, that certain herbs will help certain people with certain diseases. Now that, in fact, may be an idea, and nothing more than subjective based on a cultural experience. People in the jungle of Borneo happen to be able to help their digestive system with this particular root or this particular herb. That does not mean that that will work in the general population. It does not mean that at all. Look at the subjectivity of their history. They're living in an ecosystem, and they're living in a confined ecosystem in which they are in complete dietary response to the environment around them, and that the environment around them will have unique impact on them based on the kind of lifestyle they have. It does not mean that same herb or root is going to mean anybody in New York City on the subway. It's a totally different chemistry. They have a totally different diet. It does not mean that that is going to be universal. And of course, what has happened is that so many of these different herbs and whatever, because it's very popular today for all of these things to be investigated, that so often what you have is people saying, this works in Borneo, it's going to work for you. Now that is belief system lying, based on subjective history. And even though the subjective history is true, there's that tribe, they use that, it helps them with this, does not mean that it is a truth for the totality, and that's always our danger. And you can see how seductive that is. It's this whole pitch for olive oil that you get in America now, based on the fact that they discovered that Latins, Southern Latins, Southern Mediterraneans who use a lot of olive oil don't get certain kinds of cancer, like colon cancer. But it doesn't mean that if you're an American, and you're using a lot of olive oil, that you're going to get the benefit of that. You don't have the same environment. You don't have the same diet. You don't have the same relationship to those plants. Now, if you go to California and you go to the olive groves, where you've got people that have been living 200 years in the environment of those trees, you may in fact have a totally different response. See, this is our vanity, always thinking that we're separate and always thinking that we can make a rule out of our separateness. That's how subjectivity works. Now, obviously, they're going to find that certain drugs have a universal impact, wherever they come from. And the way they're going to know that is that they're going to know that by the lock and key mechanisms that we have in our brain for such things. If you take cocaine into your body or LSD into your body or marijuana into your body, the only reason it works is that your brain has a receptor for it. It's built into us to respond universally to that. That is not true for all herbs. It is not true for all roots. And yet we're constantly being told that's a truth. And we have no idea what it's doing to us to put into our bodies something that doesn't belong in us because we're not in that environment. Don't know. It's like all these crazy people that have, the Linus Pauling honoring society. They get a cold and they take 20,000 hits of vitamin C. This is belief system at work. There is no scientific investigation that has ever indicated for a single moment that using vast amounts of vitamin C is going to make any difference than using normal amounts of vitamin C. None. None. Do you know how many bottles of vitamin C they sell? You know what that's doing for your system? I mean, I watched vegetarians nearly die. I mean, you know, if you don't have the right kind of natural body and chemistry for that, if it is not a natural thing for you, the psychological imposition of a belief system, it is good for you not to eat meat, it is good for you not to smoke, it is good for you not to this, not to that. These are all subjective. And they're based on subjective history. We look backwards and we say, relative to our environment and our experience, this is what happens when you take this, do that, whatever the case may be. And of course, the thing is that we give ideas the power of fact, and then we can be overwhelmed by them because they're not substantiated, they're not proven, there is no true consensus, and then we have to end up digging our way out of all of that. You know, the fen-phen thing that went on here in America. There are people dropping dead from all this stuff. And again, that's when an idea has more power than logic. And the idea is rooted in the belief of people and their demands. Think about the demands right now for anything that anybody says will cure cancer. The demand is unbelievable. You know, so imagine that you're able to stop cancer in a mouse. Now, I don't care what scientists say. A mouse is not a human. I mean, I understand that there are similarities, but a mouse is not a human. It does not have a human's diet. It does not live and so forth and so on. Nonetheless, you got this mouse, you give the mouse cancer in the first place, and then you take it away. And then there's this enormous thing in the medical journals that runs for 2 weeks, you know, potential cure for cancer found in mouse experiments. And the whole belief system goes crazy. And you got all these people out there in America saying, we want it now. Do you know how fast they move these things through? Do you know how they test a toothbrush? 20 people for 1 month brush their teeth. You know, if they don't get cut, if they don't bleed, if the toothbrush doesn't fall apart, the American Dental Association will put its seal of approval on that. I mean, it's the way that it works. You can't imagine how many drugs are available in the United States that are based on research that was done with a couple of dozen people. That's spooky. This is belief system. This is not logic at work. This is very, very, very subjective. You see, they use the guise of logic. They say, we've tested it on 12 people. But that's not logic. It's still in the subjective realm. You know, when you do widespread research, all age groups, gender, race, you know, the major research programs that have taken place that have really come up with valuable resources for us, then we know that those things can work. And of course, the whole thing about belief system is that the belief system doesn't care about tomorrow. Cure me of cancer today. It doesn't matter that my children will be born with, you know, their hips out of their head. I mean, that's going on now with thalidomide again. I mean, they're selling thalidomide again. You know, it's a great drug for dealing with, you know, a certain specific illness, but we saw what thalidomide did to children. And you see, the abstract doesn't care about the future, so they don't do long-term testing. You remember the cold fusion thing? That was great, eh? You know, the whole world was jumping up and down. And of course, it was an experiment that nobody else could duplicate. Nobody else could duplicate it. It wasn't real science. It didn't work. You know, but there's still people buying cold fusion machines. There's a guy in Switzerland. He sells cold fusion machines. People believe that. There's a guy in Europe that's selling a machine that's an internal move, you know, it never stops. I mean, you know, people, the things that people believe in, it's absolutely incredible. And I tell you all that so that you grasp how profound the impact is of the abstract on our lives. After all, it's the abstract that lives this life. It lives it. It is the human way. And the voice of the abstract overwhelms us that we believe in all kinds of stuff. Has nothing to do with truth. Oh, it's so beautiful to know your authority in design. I mean, you know, it's the only chance you've got. Because your authority will smell an idea a zillion miles away. Because the unhealthiest thing for a human being is to stray from the flow without knowing that there's somewhere to go. And of course, that brings us to the metamorphic gate. It brings us to the 56, the wanderer. There's many, many things about this gate that fascinate me because I've seen its power. I don't want to get too much into the mystical stuff, but from 1939 to 1944, there was a component missing in the programming of humanity. It was missing only in the sense that it was in form here on Earth. And there's a whole generation of people that were born during that time. And during that period, Pluto was in the 56th gate. And these tend to be people that have far less rigid programming intellectually than any other generation in the last century. And Pluto being in the 56th gate, Pluto is in detriment in the 6th line. It's all about the unconscious wanderer. It's all about the vast need for stimulation, the endless drive for stimulation. You know, nothing has affected us more than the 56 in terms of the development of humanity. It is the storyteller that has made everything happen. And it is the storyteller upon which we have built our village life, our culture, and ultimately our civilization and our global civilization. It's all in the hands of the 56. And it is the 56 that cannot sit still and tell its story, but needs to travel to tell its story, needs to move around, needs to move throughout the world, needs to wander, needs to meet all of those experiences in order to be able to tell the story. Now remember that the voice of the 56, which in its quality can bring hope or despair, that this is a voice of I believe, or I don't believe. Whenever I meet somebody who has the 56th gate and they don't have the 11, I always say to them, look, don't believe in anything, because it's the greatest seduction in your life, but get everybody to believe in you. Because that's what the 56 is all about. Believe in me. Believe in me and see what I see. You know, I'm going to have a great adventure with that. I have a child, my youngest, Jiva. He has a totally undefined throat. There's only one gate in the throat. It's the 56. I'm waiting to hear what stories he's going to tell me. And you know, this is the great storytelling gate. And again, to understand how sophisticated this gate is in its metamorphosis, to recognize how profound that metamorphosis is. In other words, that the moment you conceptualize the past, the moment that you make sense out of the past, that's an inner vision. There's no language in that. It's just an inner vision. And the 56th gate has to take that inner vision and has to concretize it in language. And it can't do it the way the 62 does. You know, it can't give you a fixed pattern, give it a name, give it a formula. It can't do that. It's not dealing in fact. It has to tell you a story. If you're a 56 and you've got a problem with your partner, you can't go through a factual analysis of what's wrong with your relationship. I mean, it's never going to work. You have to tell them a story. And in telling them that story, they can get it, because that's when you're at your best. So you tell them the story about what happened to you with your last lover who acted in the same jerky way the person you're with now. You know, you tell them a story. You show them what experience has taught you. You give them a sense of your perspective and how you see things. It's like when somebody says something to you that upsets you. You know, somebody says you're a jerk. You know, and that's a word that, you know, makes your blood boil. You can go and tell the story about what happened to you. You know, why that bothers you. Whatever. I'm just making those things up. But it's important to understand that the whole process of being a 56 is that you cannot come out and give the factual goods. You got to tell a story. And if you get really good, genius is what's waiting. Because if you get really good, that story is not your story anymore. See, that's the whole point of this. It becomes a universal story. It becomes everyone's story. And of course, the moment you've got an idea that is everyone's story, then you've won your victory as an abstract being. I mean, that's why, you know, the churches and the religious hierarchies are in endless competition with each other. I mean, as long as there's another story that's got believers, you know, their story can't be it, no matter how much they want it to be it. Remember the whole thing about the abstract operates out of consensus. They're always counting. You know, there's 2 billion Catholics on the planet. You know, they're always counting, you know, to make sure that everybody knows. God forbid they ever get to 3 billion. We're really in trouble. You know, they're all counting. And it's in order to be able to get this consensus because they can't prove it. They cannot prove that God exists. They can't prove it. How are you going to prove that? You know, I mean, prove it. They can't prove it. And they can't be logical about that. There's no way. All they can do is tell you a story and hope that it becomes a universal story. Now, I mean, Christianity did that from the beginning. You know, in order to be able to placate the Roman soldiers who would have to give up their war gods, you know, the credentials of Jesus, you know, what was added to those credentials was the credentials of one of the favorite Roman war gods, Sol Invictus, originally a Syrian god, born of a virgin mother, blah, blah, blah. On the 25th of December, by the way, same birthday. You know, you borrow the universal quality of the story. You keep that universal quality going. You incorporate it into the story. If you go back and you look at the mythologies, you'll see that they all have these basic elements that they hold on to. And these basic elements are supposed to be keys that you accept. You see, he was from a virgin mother. Now, does anybody believe that? I mean, as human beings, we know, we've been through this process. This does not happen. It's cause and effect. We know that. However, by consensus, we accept that story. I mean, you know, it's a bizarre. And all the morality that comes out of that and all the other things that derive out of that. You can see that we're still in the Piscean age. You can see that belief for us is still everything, that the story is still everything. You know, we're still ready to believe the story. I mean, you can see that here in America, because in America, the favorite story is the conspiracy theory. I mean, it's a conspiracy. Everything is a conspiracy in this country. You know, and people believe this stuff. I mean, they really do. I mean, they really, you know, believe that the Warren Commission was fixed, you know, blah, 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 all of this stuff. There was actually 38 assassins, you know. I mean, they believe it. The story still has that power. Orson Welles, the Mercury Theater, you know, that famous story here in America where on radio, you know, he tells this story that the Martians are landing and all these people are panicking all over the country on April Fool's Day. Just a story. Oh, we love these stories. For years, people have been saying to me, you know, Rod, this is all incredible knowledge. Why isn't it all over the planet? It's not a story. Only stories travel like that. Rumors fly, the truth crawls. It's an old Chinese saying. It takes time to verify logic. It takes time to ingrain logic. It takes time. The abstract is impatient because it's human. We want to get things done so that we can experience them because we're going to die. You know, the abstract is racing us along. No, I don't have time to do 10 years worth of research. Are you crazy? I'm going to miss all those games. You know, no, I'm not going to do that. You're nuts. I'll give you 10 minutes. You got 10 minutes of my time. If you can't tell me that my belief is nuts, I'm busy. Sorry. You know. And we're still caught in this world. You know, when I was first given this knowledge, it was really disgusting. Because what was disgusting was I had to think about going out into the new age with all these believers and all these purveyors of belief. And to do that without being arrogant. I mean, to do that without being arrogant. And to do that without being angry. Now, the arrogance was easy. The anger is not. You know, there are moments when I hear people sprouting garbage where there is a level of anger inside of me that would be really good if I had a sword in my hand and it was 500 years ago and I could just take the fucker's head off. You know, that's the side of me that looks at all of that and says, whoa, wipe it out. But you know, we can't. We have an evolutionary process. It takes time. You know, I'm in the vanguard of what Aquarian knowledge is. And Aquarian knowledge says that the fact embraces everything. It embraces everything. But you got to know the facts. It's not about denying any idea. It's not about denying the past. It's not about denying anything. But you got to know the facts. If you don't know the facts, you're always going to be fooled. Always. If you know your authority in design, nobody is ever going to fool you. Never. It is not possible. But we get fooled all the time because we live out a conditioned life in which that's all we're waiting for. We're waiting for somebody to fool us. You know? In the first years of working in design, I only dealt with sick people. You know, I only dealt with people who were desperate, who would only come to a new knowledge, you know, they knew nothing about, other than in desperation. And you know, they had gone through all kinds of things, you know, whether it was psychiatry, psychology, drugs, therapies, this and that, and on, and they had believed every damn story along the way. You know, only to be disappointed at the end, only to be crushed that those stories weren't real, and then blaming, not themselves, that they fell for all that crap in the first place, but blaming everybody around them. It's such a sucker job. I love the 56. It is a magical gate. I love the story. There's nothing in my life I've appreciated more than stories. I don't believe them. They're entertaining. That's all. When I tell a story, it's for entertainment. That's all. If there is truth, who knows? After all, it's a perspective. All stories are a perspective. It's for the entertainment. We're here to entertain each other with our stories. I mean, it's the one thing that I love about communion with the other. It's not about what they're going to tell me about what they did today. I don't give a shit. I don't want to hear about what they think they're going to do tomorrow, because I don't care. But what they've done in their life fascinates me. That's what's incredible about people. Because they've all done something I haven't done, been places I've never been, experienced life in a way that I do not know. And that's fascinating. And by the way, when they tell me those things, I don't believe them. I don't. But it's not about I'm thinking they're lying or they're trying to do something. You know, it's not about that. It's just I don't believe them. Because I know, well, yeah, it's a story. That's all. What I take is the sense of the environment that they offer. What was going on, the feelings, whatever the case may be. That's what I grasp. Not their conclusions. Not the way they want me to follow the line of the story. It's just the story. And you see, the moment that all of us can meet the 56 with that pleasure, you know, it was like the privilege of the fool in the king's house. As long as the fool could be entertaining, no matter what it said, it wouldn't lose its head. But you know, if the fool stopped being entertaining and said the things that fools do, death, fast. And when we see that the way in which we share our experience is for our mutual entertainment, and out of that entertainment comes some of the most gratifying education we'll ever get. We get to know something about the other. We need to know as much as we can about the other. People always have a hard time with somebody who constantly talks about themselves. And you know, it's an irony, because it's the most beautiful thing we can do with each other. What's annoying is when they only talk about themselves and they don't listen to anybody else. But it is this sharing of our lives, it is the sharing of life that makes this so beautiful. So in dealing with the 56 gate, beware. Their very power genetically, particularly in the era that we live in, that their very power genetically is to fool us, to take us into their story, to take us into their inner vision, to give us the same inner vision, and when we come out of that, we're in agreement with them and their story. The moment we act on that, like acting on any authority out of the mind, we're going to be in trouble. But the moment we accept the pleasure of that, the entertainment of that, that's great. You know, then we get something very special in our communion with the other.